The desert stretched endlessly, its golden sands shimmering beneath the Chilean sun. The San Jose mine loomed like a dark scar carved into the earth. Trucks rumbled by, carrying weary men into the depths of uncertainty. Beneath the chatter and laughter of miners heading to their shift, there was an unease, subtle but undeniable. The earth here was restless, whispering its warnings through faint tremors. Inside the tunnels, the air was hot and heavy, the dust clinging to skin and lungs alike. The shafts reached far below, twisting like a labyrinth of rock and iron. Every sound echoed, drills hammering, carts screeching, voices calling through the darkness. A sudden rumble rolled through the ground, faint but sharp enough to silence the chatter. For a moment, even the machines seemed to hold their breath. Above ground, the blazing desert gave no hint of the danger brewing below. This was just another day at the mine, or so it seemed. The miners pushed deeper into the shaft, the walls pressing tighter with each step. The heat was suffocating, air heavy with dust. Tools struck stone, echoing through the tunnels like distant thunder. Silence fell when the rumble returned, stronger this time, vibrating through boots and helmets. Ricardo steadied himself, forcing a calm voice, telling others it was nothing, but his eyes betrayed unease. Luis glanced nervously toward the exit, heart pounding with the thought of escape. Daniel clenched his jaw, shoveling harder, determined to ignore the dread swelling in his chest. The ground shivered again, longer, sharper, as stones rattled and clattered down the walls. It was no ordinary shift. Deep inside, every man knew something dangerous lurked just ahead. A dull boom rolled through the earth, and the walls groaned. The tunnel shuddered, dust raining from above. Miners froze, eyes darting, breaths held as though silence could halt disaster. Ricardo barked an order, his voice sharp but laced with fear. The men scrambled, pulling carts back from the shaking walls, tools clattering against the rails. Luis stumbled, caught himself against the wall, heart racing in his chest. Daniel shouted over the noise, his words nearly swallowed by the rumble. The tremor eased, leaving only dripping sweat and pounding hearts. Dust hung thick in the stale air. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as silence pressed in, Ricardo's gaze swept the shadows, searching for cracks, for signs of what might come next. The miners regrouped, breaths uneven, hands trembling. Ricardo ordered them to keep working, though doubt flickered across his face. Luis whispered to a friend that something was wrong, his voice carrying panic. Daniel swung his shovel again, sparks flying as it struck stone, a defiant gesture against fear. The rumble returned, heavier now, the walls grinding with deep groans that echoed like a beast awakening. Small stones clattered to the ground. Miners exchanged frightened looks. Ricardo barked again, urging focus, but unease spread like fire. Luis's weakened, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above, silently begging it to hold. Daniel tightened his grip, sweat dripping into the dust, refusing to stop, even as dread pressed closer with every heartbeat. The ground erupted with a violent roar. The tunnel convulsed, walls splitting as dust exploded into the air. Darkness swallowed the lights as helmets flickered. Miners screamed, scrambling in panic as the ceiling cracked open, rocks cascading like thunder. Ricardo shouted, but his voice was lost in chaos. Luis lunged toward the exit, but a wall of falling stone cut him off, trapping them inside. Daniel shielded his head, gasping through choking dust. The collapse thundered for what felt like eternity. Then silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of men buried alive. Dust hung thick, choking lungs, blinding eyes. In that crushing stillness, one truth became clear. They were trapped, swallowed whole, by the earth itself. The dust settled slowly, hanging thick in the air, coating skin, lungs, and thoughts. The men coughed and staggered, their lights flickering in the choking darkness. Panic clawed at every breath, but Ricardo steadied himself, forcing calm into his tone as he called for silence. No one answered at first, only the rasp of breathing and the rattle of falling stones. Luis' voice broke through the darkness, shaky and frightened, asking if anyone could hear him. Daniel cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the rail, furious at the collapse and at their helplessness. The tunnel stretched behind them, blocked in every direction, silence broken only by their fear. A sense of finality crept in, the realization they were trapped deep beneath the earth, cut off from the world above. The mine had become a tomb, and yet survival demanded they act quickly. Ricardo gritted his teeth, vowing they would not surrender to despair. The men gathered in silence, their faces streaked with sweat and dust, each carrying the weight of dread. Ricardo urged them to check their supplies, his tone steady though his voice cracked with strain. Louis counted what little they had, cans, a sack of bread, bottles of water, barely enough for days. Daniel grumbled, anger masking his fear, muttering about how no one cared if miners lived or died. The others exchanged worried glances, the truth sinking deeper. They were buried alive, sustained only by their will and a handful of food. Every man felt hunger gnawing already, but it was hope they needed most. Ricardo insisted they ration, his authority unchallenged, though doubt simmered in their eyes. The men nodded reluctantly, clinging to the fragile command in his voice. Survival had just begun, and the odds were already merciless. Time dragged painfully, every second heavier than the last. Hunger gnawed, thirst parched, yet it was the silence that crushed them most. Ricardo paced, his boots scraping against stone, voice low but steady as he urged calm. Luis's stomach growled audibly, his trembling hands betraying his fear as he whispered about death. Daniel snapped, telling him to be quiet, his frustration spilling over into harsh words. The others muttered uneasily, the cracks of panic spreading. Ricardo raised his voice sharply, commanding discipline, reminding them survival meant unity. The echo of his words filled the tunnel, cutting through despair. For a moment, the group steadied, their eyes fixed on him, clinging to his fragile authority. Beneath the dust and hunger, they knew that panic could kill them faster than the earth above. The air grew heavier, thick with dust and sweat, pressing against their lungs. Ricardo forced the men to organize, dividing tasks, searching for a safe chamber, rationing water, keeping hope alive. Luis clutched a half-empty bottle, his hands shaking as he passed it along reluctantly. Daniel volunteered to check deeper tunnels, his stubborn pride refusing to yield to fear. Others followed hesitantly, their lamps cutting through the black void. Rocks shifted under boots, each sound magnified in the silence. Ricardo warned them to stay close, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he could not abandon. Though his body ached, his eyes burned with determination. They had no choice but to move forward. Survival depended not only on supplies, but on willpower, and his was the only light guiding them in darkness. Darkness swallowed the men as they pressed deeper, their lamps flickering against endless stone. Ricardo halted them, pointing to a small chamber carved by miners long before. It was tight, hot, but stable enough to serve as a refuge. The men collapsed inside, exhausted and choking on dust. Luis muttered that they were buried alive, his eyes wet with despair. Daniel cursed again, slamming his fist against the wall, swearing they would dig their way out if no one came. Ricardo silenced them, his voice ironclad, demanding faith in rescue, though doubt gnawed at him as well. They sat together in suffocating silence, rationed supplies in front of them, shadows dancing across their faces. The mine had sealed them in, but in that chamber fragile hope still flickered against the crushing weight of death. Far above the trapped miners, the desert sun blazed without mercy. The San Jose mine appeared silent, but trucks and officials crowded near the site. News of the collapse spread quickly, drawing families desperate for answers. The Jonathan Miller arrived, his eyes sharp, scanning the chaos with quiet determination. He spoke little, notebook in hand, every detail committed to memory. Government officials gave clipped statements, hiding unease behind polished words. One man, calm and controlled, insisted that everything was under control, though his gaze flickered with guarded caution. The seekers studied him closely, suspicion already forming. Families cried for news, their voices echoing into the sky, unanswered. The weight of secrecy and truth clashed in the heat of the desert air. The investigation had begun, though few realized how deep the darkness ran. The seeker moved closer to the officials, listening carefully. Edward Ramirez smiled thinly, assuring the gathered crowd that rescue operations had begun. Yet his tone lacked conviction, words polished but hollow. The seeker noticed the quick exchange of glances between officials, the hesitation in their promises. Families demanded answers, voices rising with fear and anger. A mother sobbed, pleading to know if her son was alive. The seeker clenched his notebook, his instincts screaming that lies were being told. He approached Michael Alvarez, an engineer standing at the edge, arms folded tightly. The man looked uneasy, his eyes fixed on the mine, as though he carried knowledge too dangerous to speak. The seeker leaned in, his voice quiet but firm, asking what the official would not reveal. Michael Alvarez shook his head, muttering that it was too dangerous to talk. He claimed no one wanted the truth, that silence was survival. The seeker pressed him, voice low but urgent, promising to protect him if he spoke. The man's eyes darted nervously toward the keeper, who stood tall, issuing commands with effortless authority. His presence was controlled, his words wrapped in careful deceit. Michael Alvarez whispered that the mine had been unsafe for years, corners cut, warnings ignored. The seeker wrote furiously, the pieces beginning to align. The engineer warned him to stop digging, fear etched across his face. Yet the seeker only nodded grimly, already knowing he could not turn back. The truth was buried deep, but it was waiting to be unearthed. As night fell, floodlights illuminated the mine entrance. Families huddled under blankets, refusing to leave. The seeker moved among them, listening to their stories, absorbing their grief. Mothers clutched photographs, whispering prayers. Children sat silently, eyes wide, too young to grasp the weight of fear. Michael Alvarez approached again, his resolve shaken. He admitted that rescue would not be quick, that the miners' lives depended on decisions being delayed above. The seeker urged him to speak out, but the man hesitated, torn between fear of exposure and duty to truth. Across the site, Edward Ramirez observed, his eyes sharp even in the shadows. His presence lingered like a predator watching prey, ensuring silence prevailed. The night air felt heavy with unspoken truths. The seeker confronted the keeper directly, pressing for clear answers. He asked about safety reports, about ignored warnings. The keeper's smile widened, calm and dismissive, his words dripping with practiced confidence. He denied everything, claiming the mine was sound, insisting the collapse was unforeseeable. Yet his eyes betrayed irritation at the questions. The seeker pushed harder, voice steady, his notebook recording every denial. Families gathered nearby, their hope rising as someone dared to speak truth. But the keeper leaned in close, voice dropping low, warning the seeker that some truths were best left buried. The words carried weight, a veiled threat cloaked in civility. The seeker stood firm, his determination deepening. The lines between truth and deception had been drawn, and the battle for answers had begun. The chamber reeked of sweat and dust, the heat suffocating. Men lay scattered, their bodies weak from hunger, their eyes hollow. Ricardo forced himself upright, urging them to share what little remained. Louis shook his head, muttering it was hopeless, his voice bitter. Daniel snapped, his anger boiling over, declaring they had to dig their way out. The others stirred, tension thick in the air. Ricardo's words were steady but carried strain. He demanded unity, warning that division would destroy them. Yet in the corner, a figure whispered quietly to others, sowing doubt. His words painted Ricardo as reckless, his leadership dangerous. Fear spread, quiet but sharp, like cracks running through stone. The men glanced uneasily at Ricardo, doubt settling in. In the darkness, trust began to fracture. The arguments grew louder, voices echoing off the stone walls. Ricardo insisted order was their only chance. Daniel shouted back, accusing him of wasting precious time. Louis muttered that no one above cared if they lived or died. Victor Herrera spoke smoothly, suggesting perhaps another leader should guide them. Some miners nodded hesitantly, their hope fraying. Ricardo's face hardened, anger flashing in his eyes. He reminded them of his years of experience of how panic would kill them before the earth did. Yet even as he spoke, doubt lingered in their eyes. Victor Herrera smiled faintly in the shadows, his influence spreading like smoke through the chamber. Unity cracked further, and the mind seemed to tighten around them, feeding on their despair. Hours passed, the silence thick after the storm of voices. Men avoided each other's eyes, the chamber heavy with unspoken words. Ricardo sat alone, his shoulders slumped, fighting the weight of despair. Daniel sharpened his shovel against stone, each scrape harsh in the darkness. Luis stared at the rationed bread, his lips trembling as hunger gnawed at him. Victor Herrera leaned close to another miner, whispering softly, promising escape if they followed him instead. His voice dripped with confidence, his eyes glittering in the lamplight. The miner hesitated, torn between loyalty and fear. Ricardo noticed the hushed exchange, his eyes narrowing. He rose slowly, confronting the group with weary but firm words, warning that betrayal would doom them all. But his words landed weakly, the damage already done. The ground trembled faintly again, a low groan reverberating through the stone. The men froze, their fears reignited. Ricardo shouted for calm, demanding no one move recklessly. Luis whimpered, clutching his helmet tightly, as if it could shield him. Daniel cursed, insisting they dig before the walls buried them alive. Victor Herrera seized the moment, raising his voice with false conviction, claiming Ricardo was leading them to death. Murmurs rose, heads turning, doubt spreading quickly. Ricardo's chest tightened, rage and fear colliding, but he forced his voice steady, vowing he would not abandon them. His words hung in the air, but belief had weakened. The tremor faded, leaving silence heavier than before. Trust had eroded, and survival seemed further away with every passing hour. Exhaustion consumed the men, their strength fading. The chamber fell into uneasy silence, punctuated only by shallow breathing and the distant groans of rock. Ricardo leaned against the wall, eyes closed but mind racing, desperate to hold them together. Luis muttered prayers under his breath, words trembling with despair. Daniel paced restlessly, shovel clutched like a weapon, anger simmering beneath his skin. In the shadows, Victor Herrera whispered again, this time more boldly, claiming rescue would never come, that only by following him could they survive. Several heads turned, their eyes uncertain, hungry for hope no matter how fragile. Ricardo opened his eyes slowly, catching the glances, and realized the truth. The battle was no longer just against the earth, but against betrayal festering in their midst. Above ground, days had passed, yet the desert remained silent, except for the hum of machinery and the murmurs of families camped nearby. The seeker walked among them, listening to whispered rumors of corruption and forgotten safety reports. He noticed an unfamiliar figure at the edge of the crowd, a stranger cloaked in dust and shadows. Gabriel Cruz spoke quietly, warning that the truth was deeper than anyone dared admit. His words were fragmented, cryptic, yet carried weight that stirred unease. The seeker pressed him for clarity, but the stranger smiled faintly, offering only hints. Families watched, their hope flickering between despair and faith. The seeker realized the man was not here to comfort, but to guide, though his motives were veiled. Truth was closer now, but tangled in riddles. The seeker followed the outsider to the edge of the camp, where the desert wind howled against empty silence. The outsider's voice was soft, fragmented, as he spoke of ignored warnings, of hidden deals buried deeper than the mine. He warned that those who sought truth often vanished into silence themselves. The seeker's pen raced, capturing every cryptic word, though frustration built with every half-answer. The man refused to reveal his sources, claiming knowledge was as dangerous as dynamite in the wrong hands. The seeker pressed harder, demanding clarity. The outsider's gaze hardened briefly, before softening into a cryptic smile. He told the seeker that answers lay not only above, but buried with the men below, where death and truth intertwined. Then he vanished back into the crowd, leaving only questions behind. Beneath the earth, the men clung to hope as faint vibrations echoed from above, perhaps drills, perhaps imagination. Ricardo urged them to conserve strength, though his voice carried exhaustion. Luis whispered that maybe no one was coming, despair cracking his words. Daniel cursed the silence, driving his shovel into the wall in frustration. From the shadows, a miner few had spoken to, a quiet man with sorrow etched in every line of his face, finally spoke. His story spilled like a wound, of past warnings ignored, of family lost in accidents long before. His pain revealed hidden truths. The mine had always been dangerous, built on negligence. The chamber fell silent, heavy with grief, as they realized his tragedy was tied to their own. Samuel Torres had become their reluctant mirror. Samuel Torres' voice shook as he revealed his past. His brother had died in this very mine years ago, a collapse swept under silence, buried beneath lies of safety. His grief never healed, his warnings ignored by those in power. Now he sat trapped again, his tragedy repeating in cruel symmetry. Ricardo placed a hand on his shoulder, steady though his heart ached. Luis's eyes brimmed with tears, realizing their suffering was not chance but consequence. Daniel clenched his fists tighter, vowing the truth would be dragged into the light if they ever survived. The chamber was thick with silence, the weight of history pressing harder than stone. The men understood their fate was not accident, but part of a long chain of betrayal buried deep in the earth. Above ground, the seeker pieced fragments together, the outsider's cryptic warnings merging with whispered confessions. He realized the miners were not victims of fate but of negligence and hidden truths. Michael Alvarez finally broke, admitting he had known for years the mine was unsafe, that his silence had been bought by fear and pressure. His voice trembled, guilt weighing heavy, but the seeker urged him forward, promising truth would free more than just the trapped men. Across the site, Edward Ramirez watched, his mask slipping as irritation grew. He whispered orders to those around him, eyes burning with determination to bury the story before it reached daylight. The desert night pulsed with tension. The battle for truth had grown deadly. The desert roared with life as drilling rigs arrived, towering against the endless sky. Floodlights burned through the night, illuminating engineers, soldiers, and reporters swarming the site. Families gathered at the fences, their eyes fixed on the machines that promised salvation. The seeker stood at the center, notebook in hand, his face grim yet determined. Michael Alvarez explained the plan: drill through the earth to reach the trapped men, but his voice trembled with doubt. Edward Ramirez gave a confident speech for cameras, his words polished but hollow. Gabriel Cruz lingered at the edges, his presence haunting, whispering of truths deeper than rock. The hum of drills echoed like thunder, shaking the ground. Hope and fear mingled in the desert air, fragile, volatile, alive. Beneath the ground, the men stirred as faint vibrations reached their ears. Ricardo raised his head, eyes widening with recognition. He told them to listen, drills were coming. Daniel leapt to his feet, laughing bitterly, calling it salvation at last. Luis whispered in disbelief, tears streaking down his dust-covered face. Samuel Torres shook his head, warning that hope could be a cruel trick if the drills failed. Still, the men clung to the sound, hearts pounding, spirits lifted for the first time in weeks. But whispers in the shadows carried doubts, voices murmuring that the rescue was only for the cameras, that the world above did not truly care. Victor Herrera smiled faintly, his poison dripping even into hope. Ricardo clenched his fists, vowing they would endure until light broke through. Above ground, the media descended like vultures, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. Families clung to fences, their grief and hope exposed to the world. The seeker moved among them, searching for truth in whispers and shadows. Michael Alvarez admitted that delays had been caused by indecision and politics, his guilt spilling out as microphones captured every word. Edward Ramirez intervened swiftly, smiling for cameras as he dismissed such claims. Yet his eyes burned with anger, his calm mask cracking for a moment. The Seeker caught it, writing quickly, knowing the truth was unraveling. The outsider appeared once more, whispering that betrayal would come from within, not above. His cryptic words weighed heavily, sinking into the Seeker's mind as the drills thundered louder into the earth. Underground, the sound of drills grew closer, the vibrations shaking loose dust and pebbles from the walls. Hope surged, yet fear clawed just as strongly. Daniel shouted with joy, urging everyone to prepare for rescue. Luis wept openly, whispering prayers of gratitude. Ricardo steadied them, warning that the process would take time. Yet Victor Herrera's voice slithered again, insisting the rescue was a lie, that the men would die before the drills reached them. Murmurs spread, some faces tightening with doubt. Ricardo confronted him, his voice sharp, accusing him of poisoning hope. For a moment, silence fell heavy, the men caught between belief and despair. The tremors shook again, stronger now, promising salvation yet threatening collapse. The chamber held its breath, balanced on the edge of hope and betrayal. The drilling roared louder above, but underground, betrayal struck. Ricardo discovered supplies missing, water bottles and bread hidden away in the shadows. Rage erupted as he dragged the stash into the open. The men shouted, their voices echoing like thunder. Victor Herrera smirked, but it was Daniel who froze, guilt flashing across his face. Ricardo's chest tightened as realization struck. One of their own had betrayed them. Daniel stammered excuses, claiming he only wanted to survive, his anger masking shame. Luis stared in shock, whispering disbelief. The chamber fell into chaos, accusations flying. Ricardo silenced them, voice sharp with fury, vowing that selfishness would doom them faster than the earth. Trust shattered further, betrayal burning like fire in the darkness. Survival had never felt more fragile. The drills broke through with a roar, a narrow shaft piercing the chamber below. The miners erupted in cries of joy, their voices echoing like thunder across the stone. Ricardo dropped to his knees, tears streaming as he whispered thanks. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shame and relief mingling in silence. Luis sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the wall as though it were salvation itself. Samuel Torres sat quietly, eyes wet, whispering his brother's name as though the moment healed nothing but revealed everything. Above ground, cheers erupted from families as engineers declared first contact. The Seeker stood at the edge, his heart pounding, his pen capturing history in every frantic stroke. Hope surged like fire across the desert night, but in shadows danger still lingered, waiting for its reckoning. Above ground, the site exploded with energy. Families screamed with joy, clasping each other in tearful embraces. Engineers rushed to prepare the capsule that would lift the miners one by one from their grave. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, their words carried worldwide in an instant. The Seeker recorded frantically, his heart racing as he realized truth and hope had converged in one fragile moment. Michael Alvarez stood beside him, face streaked with sweat and dust, whispering that this was more miracle than planned. Yet in the distance, Edward Ramirez clenched his jaw, eyes cold, knowing the rescue would also expose what he had fought to bury. The Seeker caught his gaze, unspoken war burning between them. The night held both celebration and menace. One by one, the miners emerged from the earth, pulled from darkness into blinding light. Cheers thundered each time, families rushing forward to embrace their loved ones. Ricardo stumbled into the air, eyes blinded, tears soaking his dust-covered face as he hugged his family tightly. Luis collapsed into his wife's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel walked out last, head bowed, shame heavy in his eyes as his son clung to him regardless. Samuel Torres emerged slowly, his steps weak, clutching a worn photograph of his lost brother. His tears fell freely as he gazed into the sky, whispering forgiveness. Above them all, the Seeker watched in silence, his pen still, overwhelmed by the raw power of survival. Yet his eyes drifted back to the Keeper, waiting for the final truth. The Seeker confronted the Keeper at the edge of the site, his voice sharp, his words cutting through the noise of celebration. He demanded answers about ignored warnings, about the negligence buried under false promises. The keeper smiled tightly, denying everything, his words polished, but his eyes filled with fury. Families gathered nearby, listening, their hope turning to anger as whispers spread. Michael Alvarez stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear, confessing the truth aloud. Gasps echoed through the crowd, eyes turning on the keeper. His mask slipped, rage flashing across his face. He hissed that some truths were poison too dangerous to speak. But the seeker stood firm, raising his voice, declaring that truth was the only light that could break the darkness. The keeper's fury broke, his voice rising as he shouted that the truth would destroy more lives than it saved. But the seeker's words drowned him, his voice carrying across the site, declaring that lies had already cost too much. Families roared in agreement, their voices uniting in anger and vindication. The keeper stumbled back, his power unraveling as eyes turned away from him. Michael Alvarez stood taller now, his guilt transformed into courage. The outsider vanished into the crowd, his cryptic role complete. The miners embraced their families, their survival a living truth no one could bury. The seeker closed his notebook, his heart heavy but resolute. Truth had come at a cost, but it had finally broken free. The desert sun rose higher, burning bright against shadows that could no longer hide.